I want you to picture a scene that I think almost everyone listening has experienced at least once.
Oh boy.
Yeah, you know the one. You're at work, maybe it's a Friday afternoon, and you're dragged into a conference room for professional development.
I can already feel the fluorescent lights buzzing.
Right. And the facilitator, who is clearly trying just a bit too hard, dumps a box of Lego on the table. Or maybe they fire up some clunky iPad app and they say, okay, everyone, today we're going to learn about synergy through play.
The dreaded mandatory fun.
Exactly. Mandatory fun. And the energy in the room just instantly dies. You're confused, you feel a little patronized, and 2 hours later you walk out thinking, well, that was a complete waste of company time.
It's a tragedy, honestly. Because usually when that happens, what do we blame?
The game.
Right. We blame the game. We say, oh, that board game was stupid or the app was glitchy.
We blame the tools. But today, we are diving into a source that says we are dead wrong about that.
Completely wrong.
We're looking at this really fascinating document released in 2025 by Julian Alvarez. It's titled The Guide de Conception d'un Serious Play Design Document, or SPDD for short.
Yeah. We retrieved this from the HAL Open Science Archive, and it's a heavy hitter in the world of educational design.
It really is.
Because what Alvarez is arguing is that the failure point in those awkward workshops isn't the software, it's not the plastic pieces, it's the script surrounding the game.
So the mission for this deep dive is to figure out what that script actually looks like. And just to be clear, we aren't talking about how to code a video game. That's a job for developers.
Right.
We are talking about how to design the human activity that wraps around the game.
Which is arguably much harder to get right. Humans are messy.
Definitely. And to get there, we have to start with a distinction that tripped me up immediately when I was reading this. The source draws a really hard line between serious games and serious play.
Yeah.
And I always just thought those were synonyms.
Most people do. I mean, in casual conversation, we use them interchangeably all the time. But in this source material, the distinction is rigorous. A serious game is a noun. It is an object.
Like the app or the board game.
Exactly. It's the tool. It's the hammer. It's the deck of cards designed to teach you about, say, supply chain management. That physical or digital thing is the serious game.
Okay, got it.
Serious play, on the other hand, is a verb. It is an event. It's the session itself, the facilitator, the arguments between players, the noise in the room, the debriefing afterward.
So the SPDD, the document we're analyzing, is the blueprint for the play, not the game.
Precisely.
The analogy that popped into my head while I was reading this was a concert.
Oh, I like that.
The serious game is the violin. It might be a Stradivarius,
Yeah.
right? A beautiful piece of engineering. But serious play is the actual performance in the concert hall.
That is spot on. You can hand a Stradivarius to a genius, but if the concert hall is on fire, or if the audience is hostile, or there's no sheet music, the performance is going to be a disaster.
And nobody blames the violin.
Exactly. Nobody blames the violin. This guide is essentially saying, stop obsessing over the violin and start designing the concert hall.
Which is a bit humbling for the game developers out there, isn't it?
It shifts the power dynamic completely. It
Right.
says the game is just one small part of a much larger ecosystem.
So let's get into the mechanics of actually designing this concert. The guide breaks down a serious play session into a timeline with 3 distinct phases.
Right.
And while they sound pretty simple on the surface, introduction, animation, debriefing the SPDD adds a lot of nuance to each one.
It creates a very structured flow. Let's look at phase 1, the introduction.
Now, in my experience, the introduction is usually just someone reading the rules as fast as possible so we can get to the fun part.
And that is mistake number 1. The source uses a specific term here, establishing the magic circle.
The magic circle. I have to say, that sounds a bit mystical for a corporate training manual.
It does, but it's a classic concept in game studies. It means creating a boundary, a temporary world where special rules apply. The introduction has to convince the learner to step out of reality, step out of their job title, and enter the circle where it's safe to experiment.
But the document points out that you can't just say, hey, let's play. You have to present the pedagogical objectives right up front.
Yes, this is crucial. You have to establish a contract. You say, we are entering this magic circle to play, but the specific goal is to understand supply chain logistics.
Why is that so important, though? Why not just let them discover the learning naturally?
Because adults are cynical.
Fair point.
If you don't explain the why, they sit there thinking, why am I rolling dice when I have 50 emails to answer? The contract aligns the player's intent with the facilitator's intent. It legitimizes the fun.
It prevents that mandatory fun eye roll we were just talking about.
Precisely. It gives them permission to engage.
Okay, so we've set the stage, we've entered the magic circle. Now we move to phase 2, which is animating the activity. This is where the game is actually running. And this section contained what I think is the most counterintuitive instruction in the entire document.
I think I know exactly where you're going with this. The concept of retreat.
Yes. Le retrait de l'organisateur. The withdrawal of the organizer.
It goes against every single instinct a teacher, a manager, or a parent has. We are trained to help. If we see someone struggling, or if the room gets quiet, we immediately want to step in and fix it. We want to guide them to the answer.
But the SPDD says don't.
It says stop. Step back.
Why? Is it just to let them have fun without someone breathing down their neck?
It's deeper than that. The source calls it the paradox of control. If the facilitator is constantly intervening, correcting, or guiding, the learner isn't actually playing the game. They are playing the teacher.
Oh, they're performing for approval.
Exactly. They are looking at you to see if they are doing it right, rather than looking at the game system to see how it responds. For the game to deploy naturally, as the SORP says, the teacher has to become invisible.
But, and this is a huge distinction the guide makes, you aren't just leaving the room to go get a coffee.
No, not at all.
The source makes it clear that this is an active withdrawal. You are very busy doing nothing, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. The guide lists specific active roles you play while you're technically withdrawn.
Let's run through those, because they paint a really interesting picture of what modern facilitation should look like. First, there's the referee.
That one is standard. You only intervene if the rules are broken or if there's a dispute the players can't resolve themselves. Otherwise, you stay quiet. You are the impartial judge.
Then there's managing ambiance and time.
Keeping the pressure on. A game without a time limit usually loses its tension pretty fast. The facilitator manages the clock to keep the energy high.
And then we get to the tricky ones. The source says you must facilitate without solving.
This is the hardest skill to master by far. You have to scaffold the understanding without giving away the answer. If a play is stuck, you might ask, have you looked at your resource cards? Instead of just saying, play the blue card.
Because if you say, play the blue card,
you break the learning loop. You rob them of the dopamine hit of solving it themselves. You've just turned them into a robot following your orders.
The source also mentions a role called offering adversity. Offrir de l'adversité. This makes the facilitator sound like a dungeon master in a role-playing game.
It's very similar. If the game is too easy, the learning stops. Boredom sets in. The SPD suggests the facilitator needs to read the room and, if necessary, throw a wrench in the gears.
Introduce a sudden crisis.
Hey, change the market conditions. Cut their budget.
So you become the system fighting back.
You do. It's dynamic difficulty adjustment, but performed by a human. And you're doing it for their benefit, to keep them in that flow zone, not just to be mean.
And the final role in this phase, which connects directly to what comes next, is the observer. The guide says you are observing to feed the debriefing.
This changes your posture completely. You aren't watching to grade them. You are watching to collect data. You're noting down specific moments, like Team A got angry when their resources were stolen, or Team B hoarded all their money. You're gathering the raw material for Phase 3.
Which brings us to Phase 3, the debriefing.
The most critical phase of the whole thing.
The source is adamant about this. It explicitly says the game isn't where the learning happens. The game is just an experience. The learning happens when you look back at it.
Exactly. If you skip the debrief because you ran out of time, which, let's be honest, happens in 90% of workshops, you didn't do serious play. You just played a game.
The SPD gives a very specific checklist for this debrief. You don't just ask, so what did you learn?
No, that's way too abstract. It starts with emotions.
Feelings.
You have to clear the emotional fog first. If a player is furious because they lost or hyper-excited because they crushed their opponent, they can't analyze logically. You have to let them vent.
Get it out of their system.
Yeah. Let them say, I felt cheated or I felt powerful.
Once the emotions are out, the guide says you move to strategies.
This is the analytical phase. What did you try? Why did it fail? And this is where the observer role pays off. The facilitator can say, I noticed you didn't trade with Team C early on. Why? Now you're holding up a mirror to their behavior.
And finally, you move to generalization.
Connecting the game back to reality. How does that lack of trading in the game reflect our siloed departments in the actual company? If you don't make that bridge, the session fails.
So the SPDD is basically a script that ensures you hit all these beats. The contract in the intro, the withdrawal during animation, and the reflection and the debrief.
It professionalizes the activity. It stops it from being just a game and turns it into a pedagogical instrument.
Now that's the timeline. But the source document introduces a second major concept, a structural model. It's called the C-Beige model.
Right, this is the architecture. If the timeline is the script, C-Beige-R is the set design.
It's visualized as a pyramid with 5 levels, numbered 1 to 5. And I have to say, the hierarchy here completely surprised me. It prioritizes things in an order that feels almost backward compared to how most people plan these sessions.
It definitely flips the traditional script. Let's look at the top of the pyramid. Level 1 is context.
Not the game.
Not the game, the context. This involves the location, the institutional culture, the technical constraints.
It seems so mundane. Checking if the Wi-Fi works. Seeing if the chairs are comfortable. Is that really the most important thing?
But think about the concert analogy again. If the acoustics in the hall are terrible, or if the room is 100 degrees, it really doesn't matter how good the music is. Alvarez is arguing that the container defines the content.
The source mentions adequation du lieu, the adequacy of the place.
Right. If you try to run a high-energy, noisy negotiation game in a library where people are trying to study, it will fail. If the tech fails, the immersion breaks. Level 1 dictates everything else.
So you check the context. Level 2 is insignia the teacher or facilitator.
This goes back to the retreat we talked about earlier. You have to assess the facilitator before you ever pick the game. Are they comfortable with chaos? Can they improvise?
Because if you have a facilitator who loves lecturing,
If they love the sound of their own voice and hate losing control, you absolutely cannot choose the sandbox game. It will be a disaster. You have to match the tool to the user.
level 3 is pedagogy.
The pedagogical objectives. What are we actually trying to teach? Is this for memorization? Team cohesion? Strategic thinking? This has to be defined before you look at any software.
Level 4 is apprenance the learners.
Who are they? Are they digital natives? Do they already know each other? Are they forced to be there? The profile of the learner changes the rules of engagement.
You're finally at the very bottom. Level 5 is Jew. The game.
The game.
It is the absolute last thing on the list.
That is the big aha moment of the Cipolage model. The game is just a device. It is a utilitarian tool chosen to fit the context, the teacher, the pedagogy, and the learners.
It's funny because if you look at how most organizations buy training, they start at level 5. They see a flashy demo of a VR headset at a conference and say, we want that.
Exactly. They buy the solution before understanding the problem. They buy a complex VR simulation that's level 5. Then they realize they don't have the physical space to run it. That's a level 1 failure.
The trainers don't know how to troubleshoot the hardware. Level 2 failure.
And the employees get motion sick. Level 4 failure.
And then they just throw up their hands and say, serious games don't work.
All right. They blame the tool again. But the SPD argues that if you start at level 1 and work your way down, you might realize that for this context and these learners, the best game is actually just a deck of index cards and a whiteboard.
And that low-tech session will be infinitely more effective than the high-tech failure.
Because it fits the architecture.
It's a very pragmatic approach. It strips away the hype and focuses entirely on the logistics of learning.
It reminds us that play is a really fragile thing. It needs a safe container. If the context is wrong, people don't play. They just follow instructions awkwardly.
The source mentions that you don't just use these two models, the timeline and the pyramid, separately. You cross-reference them.
It's a matrix. You ask, how does the context impact the debriefing? How does the learner profile impact the introduction? The SPDD is the document where you answer all those questions before you ever step into the room.
I do want to clarify one technical distinction the source makes, just so you listening don't get confused if you look this up later. We've been talking about the SPDD, but there is also something called STDD.
Yes. The STDD is the serious game design document. That is for the developers. It talks about code, art assets, hitboxes, user interface design.
Okay, SPD serious play design document is for.
It's for the trainers, the HR managers, the teachers. It describes the use of the game.
It feels like a vital bridge. Usually, developers make the game, throw it over the wall, and just hope the teachers figure it out. The SPD is the manual that explains how to actually drive the car.
And the source notes that on the HL Science Archive, they actually provide tools to help you write this. There's an evaluation grid and even an explanatory video for the C/G model. So if you are planning a workshop, you don't have to start from scratch.
So, drawing this all together, what we're seeing in Julian Alvarez's work is an attempt to professionalize the soft skills of game-based learning.
It's treating the session with the exact same design rigor as the software. It recognizes that the human element is the variable that usually breaks the system.
I keep thinking about that retreat concept, the withdrawal.
Mm.
The idea that to lead effectively, you have to actively step back. It feels applicable way beyond just game design.
It really does. It strikes a chord with modern leadership theory.
Think about parenting or managing a creative team. We often think our job is to prevent failure, to step in and fix the game before someone gets frustrated.
But the SPD teaches us that the frustration is part of the mechanics. If you solve the puzzle for your kid or for your employee, you've broken the game loop. You've stolen the learning.
You become the organizer who refuses to withdraw. You're hovering.
Exactly. You have to trust the design. If you've built the context correctly at level 1 and you've set the safety rules during the introduction, then your job is to stand back, observe, and wait for the debrief.
It requires a lot of trust. Trust in the game and trust in the players.
And trust in yourself to handle the messiness of it. Serious play is messy, it's loud, it's emotional. A lecture is clean and controlled. But the SPDD argues that the mess is where the value actually is.
So for everyone listening, here is the challenge for you to mull over. The next time you are planning a meeting, a workshop, or even a family activity, ask yourself, are you just designing the game, the rules and the tasks? Or are you designing the play, the emotional arc, and the environment?
And are you brave enough to step back and let it happen?
That is the question. Julian Alvarez's guide suggests that if you can master that withdrawal, you turn a simple activity into a serious learning event.
A shift from doing to becoming.
We'll leave you with that thought. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the SPDD.
See you next time.